Hi, gentlemen. We're going to look at Chapter 32 a little bit. In Chapter 28, we looked at the Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson presidencies. In Chapter 32, we're going to shift gears. We're going to look at Richard Nixon and then what happened in the 1970s after Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, if any of you know anything about him, most likely you know something about Watergate. It might just be a name that you've heard. If you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, you're aware it involves some sort of flashlights. Outside of that, a lot of people don't know much about Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon in 1968 was not just the Republican candidate. Richard Nixon was the candidate who claimed that he represented middle America. He represented what he called the silent majority. He promised them peace and honor in Vietnam. He promised them law and order. He promised them reduced government, return to traditional values. You got to think the late 1960s. You've got the hippies, the peace movement. Richard Nixon basically said, "Yeah, we're not going to have that. I'm gonna roll that back, right? I'm going to bring an end to the race riots. I'm going to bring an end to the urban riots. I'm going to deal with the draft dodgers, all that stuff." Now, I do want to point out very quickly when we say the silent majority concept. A lot of people are like, what is he talking about? What does he mean? Well, what he meant was in the campaign, the average American, when you say the 1960s, and we talked about this when we talked about Vietnam a little bit. When I talk about that time period, people get this image that everybody was smoking pot, wearing tie dye, trying LSD, going to Woodstock, protesting the Vietnam War, all that stuff. That was a small fraction of one segment of the American population. As I showed you during the Vietnam chapter, a lot of your younger Americans were actually supportive of Vietnam early on. Um, and even your middle-aged Americans who might not necessarily be that supportive of Vietnam, they're not the kind of people who go to a protest. They're not the kind of people who take to the streets and fight the cops and flip cars. And so Richard Nixon basically said, look, the average American is what? A working American, a taxpayer, a person who follows the law. They might not like Vietnam or this or that or the other, but they're not going out and they're not raising trouble. What you see on the news is a small fraction of America. The bulk of America is at home right now on their couch, drinking a Pabst Blue Ribbon, complaining about the hippies. The character that I have referenced for years, although I find my references becoming more dated because I realize this television show is no longer cool. It's from when I was younger. That 70s show. If anyone has seen that 70s show, you are familiar with the father character, Red Foreman. Red Foreman is the man that Richard Nixon is talking to, right? Red Foreman, the hardworking, blue collar, Johnny Six Pack American. That's who Richard Nixon was appealing to. Okay? Now, I have up here, you'll notice, not the 1968 Richard Nixon election. It's the 1964 Lyndon Johnson versus Barry Goldwater election. And I have it up here because it plays into the 1968 story. 1964, Richard Nixon looked at what happened, and he noticed a dramatic anomaly. This part of the country, which had since pre-Civil War era, and with the exception of Reconstruction, voted solidly Democrat, suddenly voted for the most conservative Republican we had yet seen, right? That this part of the Democratic stronghold South went hardcore conservative in 1964 against a Texan, no less. Please remember, Lyndon Johnson is not from Massachusetts. Lyndon Johnson is from Texas. These people voted for Barry Goldwater, a Republican, against a Democrat from Texas. Richard Nixon saw that and realized something was a happening. Now, we've already learned that Richard Nixon's opponent was Democratic Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey was the nominee because, remember, Lyndon Johnson didn't run for re-election even though he could have. Richard Nixon also had to combat a third-party candidate, George Wallace. George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, outspoken segregationist, the man who famously said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He was running. Wallace actually did the best of any third-party candidate in a long, 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 long time. This is still the 1964 election. Wallace did very well. He did better than any third-party candidate has done since, actually. He took in 13, well, at least in the Electoral College. I think Ross Perot might have done a little better in the popular vote in 1992. But anyhow, on election day, George Wallace, the third-party candidate, took in 13.5% of the popular vote, the best the third-party candidate had done since 1924, when Robert La Follette ran for the Progressives. Richard Nixon, though, won the popular vote 43.4% over Hubert Humphrey's 42.7%. So Wallace was a distant third place. He had 46 electoral votes. As you can see, he squeaked out a faithless elector in North Carolina. He took the southern states. In the popular vote, here you go. Richard Nixon, 31.785 million. Hubert Humphrey, 31.275 million. So basically 600,000 votes. 31.7 versus 31.2 million votes for the first and second place. Wallace came in a distant third. He didn't even have 10 million votes. He had 9.9 million votes. But Richard Nixon won. Okay. Now, you'll notice again, Wallace, of course, all of his support in the Deep South, segregation, etc. Hubert Humphrey did well in Texas. Most historians chalk that up to Lyndon Johnson's help, and he did okay in a few northern states, northeastern states primarily. Outside of that, though, it's Richard Nixon's ball game. The electoral vote, 301 to 191 to 46. So it wasn't even close in the Electoral College. Now, Richard Nixon was able to, we're going to get to that election later. Richard Nixon, if anybody's wondering, what did Richard Nixon's second go look like? It was a murder. Richard Nixon had the biggest win ever. He actually took every single state except the District of Columbia and Massachusetts. And McGovern isn't even from Massachusetts. McGovern's from South Dakota, if I remember correctly. He didn't even win his home state. And that's a faithless elector. This is actually tied, if you want to get technical. In 1984, Ronald Reagan beat Walter Mondale like a drum. And 1984, Ronald Reagan won every state except for Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has never voted for a Republican since it got electoral votes. But in 1984, Ronald Reagan won every electoral state vote except for, he did not win D.C., and I want to say he did not win Minnesota. Walter Mondale is from Minnesota. So if you want to look at sheer numbers, Ronald Reagan actually had the biggest win margin because Massachusetts was worth more electoral votes than Minnesota. But here you go. Richard Nixon won 49 of 50 states in 1972. Anyhow, what's going on? Well, Richard Nixon played the Southern strategy. Okay. One of the keys to his victory was the South. I realize some of you are like, you just showed me how the South went George Wallace. Well, everything else in the South went Richard Nixon, right? Okay, not counting Texas, but let's look at this. Richard Nixon picked up, what is that? 44, 52, 66. 66 electoral votes. Now, I'd like to point out, Richard Nixon won 301. Now, let's not change any of George Wallace's votes, okay? Let's leave them as they are. So if Richard Nixon had not won those, he would have only gotten 235 votes. If those 66 votes had gone the way of Hubert Humphrey, he would have had 257, right? So if this part of the country would have voted Democrat like it always did before 1964, this would have actually not even been, there would have been no clear-cut winner because Mr. Wallace would have messed up the math. But Richard Nixon actually got over the threshold and won because of these southern states. And again, Democrats usually win southern states. What happened? Richard Nixon played what is known as the Southern strategy. He had some advisors who had figured out the South had changed. The South had long been the Democratic stronghold. But Richard Nixon decided not to give up on it because he saw the 1964 election numbers and he knew something was up. So he contacted Strom Thurmond, the incredibly powerful, long-time serving senator from South Carolina, also a presidential candidate in 1948 for a third party called the Dixiecrats. But anyhow, he called up Strom Thurmond. He's like, what do I got to do to win Southern votes? Strom Thurmond said, okay, first of all, you got to promise to do a few things that we Southerners want. First of all, you only appoint conservatives to the federal court system. You promise to name a Southerner to the Supreme Court. You stand up to court-ordered busing, which was a technique to try and integrate schools by literally busing white children from the suburbs to inner city schools and then busing African-American children out of the inner city to suburban schools. So he said, you basically stand up and say you're gonna fight court-ordered busing and name us a vice president that Southerners will accept. He eventually chose Spiro Agnew, governor of Maryland, and Maryland is close enough to the South that the people of the South would accept Spiro Agnew. And so basically Richard Nixon was told by an incredibly powerful Southern senator, you want Southern support, you got to say things Southerners want to hear, man. Right? You're going to name some Southerners to the court, you're going to slow down this integration thing, and give us a Southern vice president. Nixon did it. And large numbers of white Southerners left the Democratic Party. Hubert Humphrey only won, like I said, Lyndon Johnson's home state of Texas. Wallace got the rest of the South, but, excuse me, not the rest. He got half the South, but the other half of the South went Republican, right? That's a lot of votes, okay? It worked. And you're going to see those very same, but everybody voted for him in 72, so I don't know if you can really count that. But Richard Nixon was able to win over large numbers of Southerners as time went on. And the South has been Republican ever since Richard Nixon. Okay? Hang on a moment. So for those of you who think I'm exaggerating this Southern love for Democrats, and this loyalty of the South to the Democrats, this is every election since Reconstruction basically ended. Almost. I don't have, 1876, but 1888, right? South, 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 South. The only time the Republicans did any damage really and truly into the Southern stronghold was they nipped off a few in 1928, but remember, Catholic Alfred Smith was running, and it was the boom of the 1920s. Thank you, Republicans, right? And then, of course, that did not work. Democrats. Here's that third party, Dixiecrats. So while it looks like a third party, it was Strom Thurmond, incredibly powerful Southern senator who ran on like states' rights and anti-civil rights. Okay. Here you go, 1952, 56. I mean, a little bit, but some of that had to do with who the Democratic candidate was. Okay, but you can all of a sudden, right? Richard Nixon suddenly sees something has happened. Something has switched, right? A region of the country that voted Democrat. I mean, you think about it. Every single election, these states had voted Democrat, right? And I'm counting the Dixiecrat as a Democrat because it's a Southern Democrat, okay? Every single one of them. Every single one of them. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait, what? And he went with it. Now, really quickly, I'll go ahead and ruin a future lecture, sort of. Some of you are like, oh, there goes your theory, McCoy. That is a Democrat running for the Democrats. That is a Southerner running for the Democrats. Southerner from Georgia, Jimmy Carter. Take a Southerner out of the equation, there you go. Well, he's still in there. That's Ronald Reagan, whooping up. Reagan. Some of you are like, oh, what happened there? Southerner from Arkansas, Bill Clinton. All right? It didn't even work for Al Gore. We'd had enough of them. All right? And here you go. Okay? Barack Obama. Yeah, not happening, right? Southerners aren't going for that. The only time, if you look at it, since the era of Richard Nixon, The only time that Southerners turn out in large numbers to vote Democrat is when a Southerner is running. And even then, it's nothing like it was back in the old days. It's not like when Grandpa voted, right? Or if you're me, when your dad voted. Right? I mean, look at that. Back in the day, man, the South was Democrat. And now you're lucky to get 4 or 5 of the states to go Democrat, even when you have a Southern governor running. So Richard Nixon really tapped into something. He understood that the waters had changed, and he helped make them permanently change, right? Now, Richard Nixon did not undo everything, right? He did appoint, the Southerners, as we'll see, to the judiciary. He did try and make statements to stop court ordered busing and things of that nature. Um, I mean, he did do some of it, but he didn't carry through on everything. But he did win over Southern support by appearing to support things that they were more for. And this is something we're going to talk more about in chapter 33 when I look at the emergence of modern conservatism. So I'm going to kind of save some of this for a later date. Now, Richard Nixon won because he promised, middle America, the average American, the silent majority, end of the Vietnam War and peace and honor and law and order. And he announced very quickly, with his Attorney General John Mitchell, that we were going to draw a hard line against what he termed militants. He said, we're going to enforce the law against draft evaders, radical students, deserters, civil disorder, organized crime, street crime. I mean, Richard Nixon basically just said, we're not going to tolerate this lawlessness. We're not going to tolerate the riots. We're not going to tolerate the violence. Richard Nixon is the man who started the war on drugs, if you're curious, right? Richard Nixon is the man who officially declared war on drugs. If you're wondering when America's policies regarding various substances and incarcerations, etc., Richard Nixon was the man who started that. And so Nixon was a big believer in we got to go on the offensive against crime. Nixon also was opposed to what much of the Warren Court had done. If you remember what we talked about in chapter 28, actually 28.1, Warren Court had extended the rights of the accused, of the arrested, right? And Richard Nixon kind of felt like we'd given all the rights to the criminals and we'd made it impossible for the police to do their job. Now, the president can't overturn that, right? Richard Nixon can't undo what the Supreme Court does. But he did promise that he would replace judges on the court as they stepped down or died with judges that would support the rights of the police over the accused. So, shortly after Richard Nixon took office, Justice Earl Warren retired, and he was replaced by Warren Burger, a very well-known and respected conservative judge. Richard Nixon was eventually able to place 3 more conservative judges on the court, including a Southerner, as promised. Unfortunately for President Nixon, the Burger Court did not reverse some of the Warren Court's rulings, but they did stop the expansion, right? For example, in the case of Stone v. Powell in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled on the limits that there are limits, of the right to appeal state convictions to the federal judiciary. The Burger Court also upheld the legality of capital punishment or the death penalty. Although some people do bemoan a few rulings. For example, when there was a case that came up that gave the Supreme Court the chance to strike down court-ordered busing, they upheld it. And that's really ironic because the deciding vote was the very judge that Richard Nixon had appointed to the Supreme Court. It's a classic example. It's one that my government class discusses. Judges don't work for the president, and they're going to rule based on the case, based on the law. And so it's somewhat ironic. President Nixon got all these Southerners to vote for him because he promised, I'm going to put a judge on the court who's going to stop court-ordered busing. And when the court gets a chance to stop it, the very judge that Richard Nixon named voted, we got to uphold it. Also, it was during the Richard Nixon years that the Supreme Court legalized abortion in Roe v. Wade. So again, not always to the conservative liking. Richard Nixon, when it came to government, he wanted what he called new federalism. Now, what did he mean by new federalism? It's not that he was getting rid of federal funding. He understood the federal government was very important in getting things done at the state and local level, but he felt that the government, that the federal programs, the programs run out of Washington, D.C., were horribly ill-equipped. They were very wasteful. They were not very efficient. He realized that if you think about it, the closer the government is to the people it actually serves, the better it does its job because the more in tune it is with their needs. And so what Richard Nixon wanted to do is he wanted to replace all these big federal programs with state and local programs funded by the federal government, right? Now, this was called New Federalism, and the idea was revenue sharing. Okay, Congress would create a bunch of bills that would grant federal funds to state and local programs. So instead of the money going to a federal program, it would go to a state or local program that would take over a job once done by the federal government. And they thought this would be more efficient. That is not a bad idea in theory. Here's the problem. In order to qualify for the funding from the federal government, they put all these conditions, all these rules, regulations, stipulations, strings, red tape, whatever you want to call it. Basically, the federal government was like, here's what your program's going to look like, right? If you want our money, you got to do X, Y, and Z. And there were some states and programs that were like, but that doesn't really work for us. That doesn't make sense. Like, that defeats the purpose. And the government's like, well, too bad. It's our money. If you want our money, you got to do what we want. And so while it was a good theory, the execution was quite flawed because the government put too many rules on the money to make sure that certain things that they wanted done got done whether your local program wanted it done. And so what ended up happening was, yes, the federal government was no longer in charge of actually managing the program, but the federal government was controlling many of the rules. And it didn't really make anything better. It didn't really cut the budget. It didn't really curb spending. It didn't really fix anything. It just created a new way for people to complain, or a new thing for people to complain about, I guess, in the government. I do want to point out too, while Richard Nixon was trying to, limit how much the federal government was doing, he did try and increase the power of the executive branch. He tried to do this in large part because Richard Nixon he did not play well with others. Richard Nixon and Congress had a very poor relationship. And he had a very poor relationship with most politicians, to be quite honest. And the fact that he didn't get along with Congress made it difficult to get anything done because nobody in Congress really wanted to cooperate, right? And this is a topic you learn in government when you study it, but you don't need the president to get elected to Congress, right? You don't need to be his buddy. You don't work for him, right? You run for election on your own. And so people in Congress, if they want to work with you, they'll work with you. If they don't, they won't. And since Richard Nixon didn't have good relationships, people in Congress didn't want to work with him. And so they oftentimes would pass laws or support programs he didn't like. By the way, another problem was the Republican Party was in minority in both houses. So you have a Republican president facing a Democratic Senate and House of Representatives. That only makes matters worse. And every time that they would basically try and pass a program he didn't like, he would try and impound the funds. What that means is he would not basically sign the check, for lack of a better metaphor. He basically would not allow the money that Congress granted to a program to actually go to the program. He held on to it. Eventually, the Supreme Court declared that was unconstitutional and you have to release the money. But that's an example of Richard Nixon trying to give the president more power than he traditionally had. One program that Richard Nixon, though, did try to reform was Aid to Families with Dependent Children. AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or as most of us know it, welfare. Right? The program was unpopular on both sides of the aisle. Republicans and Democrats both had issues with it. Some argued that the problem with AFDC was the way it was designed, you're better off just staying on welfare than trying to get off welfare, right? So let me give you an example. you're on welfare. Okay, let's just pretend you are a single mother. You are on welfare, right? You live in a government housing project. You want to get off welfare. The only way to get off welfare is to get income, right? So you go out and you find a job. But now that you have a job, during the day, you have to have childcare for your kids, right? You've got to get childcare, which is an expense. Some of you might say, there's government childcare. Okay, you get a government childcare program. You still have to get to work. You still got to pay for bus fare, or you got to get a car, or what, there's expenses, right? And you might end up busting your butt and you're only making a little more than you would have made if you sat on welfare, right? And basically, people just argued there's no incentive for people to get off welfare. Um, and that's why we started to see generational welfare. Basically, parents would be on welfare and then their children would end up on welfare. There was also a problem that um, states had different rules and regulations regarding welfare, and so it was very confusing and difficult to manage for the federal government. So in 1969, Richard Nixon proposed replacing AFDC with what he called the Family Assistance Plan. The plan called for providing needy families with a guaranteed yearly grant of $1,600 a year. So any family that qualified would be able to receive from the government $1,600 a year. Now, $1,600 a year, 1969 money to today's money, is $11,313, roughly. Okay? So basically, Richard Nixon said, we will give families $11,313 a year. And they can supplement it with outside income if they need more, right? If you want more money than that to live off of, you can go get a job. Okay? Many liberals applauded the program because we were guaranteeing people an income. But Richard Nixon argued, see, what's great about this is it's a flat rate. It's very simple to manage. It's going to cut costs. It's going to cut oversight. It's going to eliminate a lot of the cheating. It's going to encourage people to actually go out and work, because $11,000 isn't exactly a whole lot of money to support a family on. Even if you had no bills except like food and basic necessities, that is less than $1,000 a month, guys. That's not a lot of money for, like, let's say a family of four. And let's say that there are two adults in that equation. You are going to feed, clothe, take care of four human beings on less than $1,000 a month. That's rough. I guess you could do it. But let's be real. You're going to be motivated to go get a job to make that work out a little better for you. And so conservatives were told, this is going to get people to go to work, and it's going to encourage them to find ways to get out of this program because it's enough to survive, but it's not enough to be comfortable. The program won approval in the House of Representatives, but it came under attack. Welfare recipients said, of course, it was not enough money. Conservatives did not like the fact that it was just guaranteed money. Conservatives are not fans of the idea of just giving away money. And so the program was defeated in the Senate. So unfortunately for Richard Nixon, his grand scheme to reform welfare failed. But I don't think he was too brokenhearted, because to be honest, Richard Nixon didn't care. And that's harsh. Richard Nixon was not very interested in domestic policy, what was going on in America. Richard Nixon's great passion was foreign policy. Okay? As one State Department official recalled, the president had, and I quote, monumental disinterest in domestic policies. Richard Nixon wanted to assign or create what he called a competent cabinet, a bunch of advisors that would run the United States, while he could focus on foreign affairs, politics with other countries, figuring out an answer to the Cold War, right? That was his thing. So basically, Richard Nixon didn't really want to run the United States. He wanted to basically do State Department work. Gentlemen, his foreign policy was in part designed by his good advisor, Henry Kissinger, who I mentioned during the Vietnam chapter. Henry Kissinger, former Harvard professor, a man who had fled to this country as a teenager prior to World War II. He fled Nazi Germany in 1938. He was Jewish. He had served as a foreign policy consultant for Kennedy and Johnson. That gives you an idea of just how respected his advice was. Two Democratic presidents had this guy on speed dial, so to speak, because they thought he was such a good person to get the opinion of. And then a Republican president, who, by the way, lost to John F. Kennedy in 1960, so it's his rival. Nixon's like, I need you working by my side at the White House. But anyhow, um, the Secretary of State theoretically outranked Kissinger, but that's okay. Kissinger had a made-up job. Um, it's not exactly made up, but Henry Kissinger was like, I can't even remember the official job title, but it was like Chief Special Assistant for Foreign Affairs. It's just some title that gives him an office in the White House so Richard Nixon can just literally walk over and talk to Kissinger whenever he wants. It also means Kissinger has no official job. So Kissinger can do whatever Richard Nixon wants and it doesn't affect anything. Um, but anyhow, Kissinger and Nixon kind of created this new approach to foreign policy. And it all centered around the fact they had a new worldview. And what was that new worldview? Well, both men both men looked at the Cold War in a new light. Okay, and it's interesting because this is Richard Nixon. This is Mr. Anti-Communist. This is the man who cracked the Alger Hiss case way back in the day. I mean, Richard Nixon is an outspoken anti-communist, right from way back. He and Henry Kissinger, though, had a new view of the Cold War. It's not just an us versus them. It's what they called a multipolar world. It is not the United States versus the Soviet Union. Yes, it's the United States versus the Soviet Union. But there are a bunch of countries that are on either team that are like up for grabs, like India, like large parts of Africa, like Brazil. Whose team are they on? Some of these people are outspokenly neutral, and Kissinger was like, we got to get them to kind of sort of be our friends, but we can't force them, but we got to be careful we don't let them go to the Soviets. And they understood that it wasn't just us versus them. It was a far more complex game. And for 20 years, America had been playing it like it was a two-man game. And it wasn't a two-man game. There were a lot more people on the court at the time. And so, for example, too, they believed that running away from Vietnam would be a terrible move, right? A terrible idea for the United States. It would destroy our credibility, right? They believed we had to slowly work our way out of Vietnam and would make America look at least respectable, right? They felt that America's just anti-communist stance was too rigid. We needed more flexibility. John F. Kennedy wanted flexible military response. Richard Nixon is taking a flexible political response. Richard Nixon understands that for 20 years, our answer was communism bad, anything not communism good. And Richard Nixon was like, yeah, we're giving ourselves no room to maneuver, right? And if we're not going to nuke these people, if we're not going to fight World War III, if we're not going to go at it, we've got to find a way to live with them and work with them and negotiate with them, right? We can't live on the brink of nuclear war for the rest of time. And he said we needed to be a little more flexible, right? We got to contain communism, but we need to find a way to negotiate and engage. And of course, the answer to it all is, well, first of all, he proposed what he called détente, right? Which is a French word which means a relaxation of tension. And it's interesting that détente came from Richard Nixon. I'll get to his détente plan in a moment. It's funny that Richard Nixon was the man who brought us détente because the Soviet Union was super unhappy when he won. Again, this is Richard Nixon, outspoken anti-communist. Pushed for communist trials in the 40s, during the Red Scare. He had been Eisenhower's vice president and had been in the White House when we had our massive military buildup and massive retaliation and built up our nuclear arsenal. It was unwelcome news in Moscow, according to one Russian official. But Richard Nixon, again, while he was a staunch anti-communist, he understood it was multipolar, and he wanted to relax the tension. And he understood that the best way to relax tension with the Soviet Union was through China. I want to point out, too, by the way, for anybody who thinks Richard Nixon was caving to the communists, as Richard Nixon said, we must understand that détente is not a love fest. It is an understanding between nations that have opposite purposes, but which share common interests, including the avoidance of a nuclear war. Such understanding can work, that is, restrain aggression and deter war, only as long as the potential aggressor is made to recognize that neither aggression nor war will be profitable. He's not saying we're going to become friends. He's saying we're going to learn to get along. We're going to learn to live with each other. Um, for lack of a better metaphor, it is like you don't like your neighbor, right? For whatever reason, you and your neighbor do not get along. But you realize you're not going to sell your house. You like your house, right? And your neighbor likes his house. He doesn't like you, but he likes his house. Your neighbor's not going to sell his house. You're not going to sell your house. You can't fight your neighbor in the street every night. You can't burn down his house. You got to find a way to live next door to this guy, right? You got to share the cul-de-sac. That's détente. It's not saying we're going to become friends. We're not going to start hanging out, right? You're not going to come to my barbecue. But I'm also not going to sit there and think of ways to blow up your home, right? And it all starts with China, which sounds really weird. But you have to realize, remember, China had fallen to the communists in 1949. And ever since then, America had refused to recognize the Chinese government in Beijing. We kept acting like Taiwan was the real government of China, and everybody knows that's a joke. Well, Richard Nixon basically announced we were changing our policies on China. Richard Nixon said, we're going to start trading with China. I'm going to start allowing Americans to travel to China. I'm going to pull the 7th Fleet out of Taiwan and kind of de-escalate the situation and kind of pull back the American military from the border of China. And then Richard Nixon said, we're going to go to China. And Richard Nixon, in February of 1972, became the first American president to go to China. And he met with the leaders of China, and they had dinners, and they went to the Great Wall, and they took pictures, and he watched ping pong and all this other stuff. And he promised that the United States and China would establish more normal relations. And he obviously was actually trying to build a relationship with China, but he understood something a lot of Americans didn't know. China and Russia were enemies. Now, they were both communists. But what a lot of Americans didn't understand, and this is something we talked about when we were in chapter 26, every American assumed communism was this vast global conspiracy directed from Moscow. There are multiple branches of communism in the world. Back then, the two primary ones was the Marxist-Leninist style of communism practiced in the Soviet Union, and then there was the form of communism practiced in China, which was preached by Mao Zedong, which basically what had happened was in the late 50s, early 60s. Basically, the Soviets started to try and tell China what to do, and China was like, "Look, we're not new to this game. Maybe in 1950, when we just won the Civil War and we just became communist, you could tell us what to do. We're China. We're home to hundreds of millions of people. We're almost as big as you. We've got all the potential you have. You're not going to tell us what to do. You're not going to lead communism for the entire world." And basically, China and Russia got into an argument as to who was really a communist and who was leading the communist world and everything. It's called the Sino-Soviet Split. A lot of Americans are unaware. There were border skirmishes between Chinese troops and Russian troops. Several hundred troops were killed in the 60s in border incidents between these two countries. They do share a border, a longer one in the east and a very short one between Mongolia and oh goodness, what's the country? I guess India and Pakistan. Anyhow, they had skirmishes. A lot of Americans don't know. The reason that China developed her own nuclear arsenal was to protect herself from the Soviets. It wasn't to protect herself from us. China was never afraid of getting nuked by us. Why would we nuke China? They didn't have any nukes. Why would we nuke them? They're not a threat. They developed nukes so they could keep the Russians away. We knew that. Richard Nixon knew, when I say we, the government knew that. The CIA knew that. Richard Nixon knew that. The average American didn't know that. And Richard Nixon understood China and Russia were enemies. And so Richard Nixon understood he had a better chance of turning around the relationship with China than with Russia. And he also understood that if Russia watched us suddenly become friends with China, Russia would have to worry about us teaming up, right? Russia cannot afford to be going up against the United States and China. And they saw us playing kissy face, in the words of former Cub Scout teacher Jack Kalin. And what do you know? The Russians were like, hey, why don't you come on over for a visit? And the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, I mean, he invited Richard Nixon to come over and have a meeting, a summit in Moscow and see the sights. And not long after he got home from China, Richard Nixon in May of 1972 went to Moscow and he became the first American president since World War II to visit the Soviet Union, right? He spent 11 days in the Soviet Union. He visited industrial facilities and oil fields and all sorts of stuff. You know, while he was there, he and the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed a number of agreements promising increased trade, sharing scientific information. We planned a joint space mission called the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where Americans and Russians would meet in space and do a little joint space mission. And we signed SALT. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, a plan to limit nuclear weapons between the two nations. Um, Not to reduce nuclear arsenals, but to put a limit on how large we were going to build our nuclear arsenals. And détente started to work, it appeared. America and the Soviet Union began to back away from the tension that we had in the early 1960s, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis and all that stuff. Interestingly, the Soviets said that the Nixon presidency was when the United States and the Soviets had their best relationship of the entire Cold War. That they found in Richard Nixon a man they could work with, a man who understood that the game was far more complex than the one we'd been playing previously. Um, I mean, 1972 was a golden year for Richard Nixon, man. And he is going to screw it up big time, as we shall see in our next section when we look at Watergate and the downfall of Richard Nixon.